At the turn of the 20th century, Moscow was a city on the brink of transformation. As the world entered a new era of scientific discovery and technological advancement, the promise of progress seemed limitless. But beneath the surface of this optimism, darker forces were at work, forces that would push the boundaries of ethics, humanity, and scientific knowledge itself. One of the most disturbing chapters in Russian medical history began quietly in a small, inconspicuous laboratory, where a controversial neurological experiment would soon unravel in ways that no one could have predicted. In 1903, a prominent neurologist with a reputation for pushing the limits of science embarked on a groundbreaking study that aimed to delve deeper into the mysteries of the human brain than any researcher had dared before. It was an experiment that, at its core, promised to unlock secrets about the mind, disorders of the brain, and the very nature of consciousness itself. The research seemed promising, driven by a sense of curiosity that matched the rapid strides being made in other fields of science. The emerging discipline of neurology had already made significant progress, but it was still in its infancy. Scientists and doctors were hungry for more answers. And the allure of uncovering the truth about the human mind, with all its complexities, drove many to pursue knowledge without considering the ethical boundaries that such knowledge required. What started as an exploration into the inner workings of the brain soon spiraled into a deeply disturbing tale of medical experimentation that no one intended to see through to the end. The experiment itself, its methods, and its consequences would eventually become so grotesque, so horrifying, that it would be erased from public memory, buried deep beneath the weight of secrecy and shame. What was meant to be a scientific triumph became one of the darkest chapters in Russian medical history, one that would never be fully revealed, and its details would remain shrouded in mystery for decades. The story began with a man, an ambitious, skilled neurologist who had been captivated by the idea of understanding the brain in a way that no one had before. At the time, neurology was a frontier science, barely beginning to scratch the surface of the vast, uncharted territory that lay within the human mind. For years, scientists had been speculating about how the brain worked, how it controlled thoughts, emotions, and bodily functions. But much of this understanding was based on conjecture, educated guesses, and early-stage theories. There were few concrete answers, and even fewer ethical guidelines when it came to pushing the boundaries of experimentation. The scientist at the center of this experiment was one of the most well-respected figures in the field of neurology in Moscow. His reputation preceded him, and his ambition was boundless. But it was this ambition that would eventually lead him down a dangerous path. Driven by a desire for groundbreaking discoveries, he was willing to take risks that others would shy away from. He had a vision of unraveling the intricate workings of the brain and discovering how far human consciousness could be manipulated, altered, and understood. In his mind, the end goal justified any means, and the potential benefits of such discoveries would far outweigh the ethical quandaries that others might have had. With this mindset, the experiment began. What started as a simple, focused study quickly became something far more complex and dangerous. The neurologist chose to focus on the human brain's most complex and least understood aspects, the regions responsible for memory, emotion, and behavior. These were the areas where medical science had little understanding, and it was believed that if they could be unraveled, it could revolutionize the treatment of mental illnesses, brain injuries, and even psychological disorders. The experimenters believed they could find a way to treat patients suffering from neurological diseases, perhaps even curing some of the most intractable conditions of the time. However, the methods they used were questionable from the very start. At a time when surgical practices were still crude by modern standards, and anesthesia was far from perfect, the idea of conducting brain surgery on live subjects seemed reckless, even dangerous. Yet the researchers pushed ahead, undeterred by the growing concerns of their peers. They believed that their work could change the course of medical history and elevate them to the ranks of the great pioneers of science. But they were not prepared for the horrific consequences of their actions. The subjects of the experiment were chosen from among those who were considered expendable, patients who had been deemed unfit for regular treatment or those suffering from conditions that were deemed hopeless. Many of these individuals were poor, marginalized members of society, often homeless or mentally ill. They were desperate for treatment, and in their vulnerable state, they were offered the promise of a cure, something that was all too rare in the medical world of that time. Most of them had no idea what they were signing up for, and if they did, they had no real understanding of the risks involved. They were told that the experiment could change their lives, but no one warned them of the dangers that would soon unfold. The first signs of trouble came quickly. As the procedures began, the researchers noticed that the results were not as they had expected. Instead of improving the condition of their patients, the experiment caused a range of unforeseen and disturbing side effects. Some subjects began to experience severe cognitive dysfunctions, hallucinations, and violent mood swings. Others exhibited unusual physical symptoms, tremors, paralysis, and even seizures. These were the kinds of reactions that the researchers had hoped to avoid, and yet they seemed to be inevitable. What had started as an effort to heal the mind was now harming it in ways that no one could have predicted. But the neurologist, obsessed with the potential of his work, refused to stop. Rather than halt the study and reassess the methods, he chose to press forward. He believed that these side effects were merely temporary, that they could be overcome with more trials, more adjustments to the procedure. He convinced himself that this was just the cost of progress, that these sacrifices would ultimately lead to a greater understanding of the human brain. But as the number of patients suffering from these debilitating effects grew, it became increasingly clear that the experiment was spiraling out of control. Yet, the scientist pressed on, his obsession blinding him to the pain and suffering he was causing. As the weeks and months passed, the results became more alarming. The researchers started to cover up the worst of the outcomes, fearing that exposing the true nature of the experiment would destroy their careers and reputations. What had once been an open, ambitious scientific study now became a clandestine operation, hidden from the public eye. Medical journals were never allowed to publish the findings, and the subjects were silenced, their voices lost in the chaos of the experiment's aftermath. By the time the full extent of the horror had become clear, it was too late to stop. The damage had been done, and the story of the forbidden neurological study was locked away in the dark recesses of medical history. It was buried so deep that for many years, no one outside of the inner circle even knew it had happened. The scientist's name was erased from the records, and the study was quietly dismissed as a failure, a dark, forgotten moment that was better left unexamined. Yet, despite the secrecy, whispers of the study's true nature lingered in the shadows. There were those who knew what had happened, who saw the aftermath of the experiment in the lives of its victims. And even though the official narrative had been erased, the story of the forbidden brain study would not remain forgotten forever. It was a mystery that would continue to haunt those who had been involved, and anyone brave enough to seek the truth would eventually uncover the chilling tale of a scientific experiment that was never meant to end. In the early 1900s, Moscow was a city of contrasts, where ancient traditions and rapidly advancing scientific ideas collided in an atmosphere charged with change. The Russian Empire, under the reign of Tsar Nicholas II, was on the brink of a seismic transformation. In the streets, one could hear the rumble of revolution in the air, an undercurrent of discontent that would soon erupt into the Russian Revolution of 1917. But in the scientific and medical communities, Moscow was already a place where ideas about the human body and mind were being turned upside down. The quest for knowledge and understanding of the human condition had never been more urgent, and the world was on the cusp of discoveries that would alter the course of history. Neurology, in particular, was becoming one of the most dynamic and controversial fields. At this time, Russian science was still in the process of catching up with Western Europe, where groundbreaking research had already begun to unlock the mysteries of human biology and psychology. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were marked by rapid industrialization and technological innovation, with a growing interest in the human mind as the final frontier. In the West, figures like Sigmund Freud were beginning to reshape our understanding of the unconscious, while in Germany, scientists like Carl Wernicke were making critical contributions to the study of the brain and its functions. But in Russia, the field of neurology was still in its infancy, struggling to make sense of a world that had become obsessed with understanding the brain. The atmosphere of scientific exploration in Moscow was charged with optimism, but also with a sense of caution. While many doctors and researchers were eager to push the boundaries of knowledge, they were also acutely aware of the limitations of their tools and understanding. The late 19th century had brought forth exciting advances in the study of the brain, such as the discovery of the neuron, the development of cerebral localization theories, and the emerging field of brain surgery. Yet, the actual understanding of the mind, its diseases, its functioning, and its potential for manipulation, remained elusive. The discoveries made in Western Europe were considered groundbreaking, but Russia was still largely dependent on older, more conventional methods of treatment. The methods were often crude by today's standards, and the ethical implications of some scientific practices were still in the early stages of debate. The field of neurology in Russia was not only struggling with limited knowledge but also with a lack of advanced medical infrastructure. In many ways, the country was still rooted in a past dominated by mysticism and superstition. The public's understanding of mental illness and neurological disorders was rudimentary at best, and the treatment of patients suffering from these conditions was often as harsh as it was ineffective. Mental illness was not yet understood as a medical condition, and those who suffered from it were often seen as cursed or possessed. In many cases, those diagnosed with mental health issues were sent to asylums, where they were subjected to brutal treatments like confinement in chains, electroshock therapy, or even lobotomies, methods that were still in their infancy but already seen as necessary evils. But it was in this charged, uncertain atmosphere that neurology began to take off in Moscow. While other parts of the world had already begun to explore the brain's structure and function in detail, the Russian scientific community was just beginning to dip its toes into the waters of neurological research. The rising wave of scientific inquiry was matched by a growing sense of urgency, an eagerness to contribute to the world's understanding of the mind, to stake a claim in the emerging field of brain science. Neuroscientists in Russia were passionate about bringing new ideas to the forefront, but they were also eager to catch up with their European counterparts, many of whom had already achieved significant breakthroughs. It was in this environment of both intellectual ambition and a thirst for knowledge that the experiment in Moscow would be born. The ambitions of the neurologists in Moscow were shaped by a combination of factors: scientific curiosity, political upheaval, and the lure of progress. At the turn of the century, Russian society was still deeply entrenched in traditions that went back centuries. The rigid hierarchy of the Tsar estate, the deep-rooted Orthodox Christian values, and the entrenched system of nobility all conspired to create a society that was both resistant to change and yet simultaneously ripe for revolution. The Industrial Revolution, which had taken root in the West, was just beginning to make its way eastward, and Russia was being forced to reckon with modernity. For many Russians, science became a way to move beyond the constraints of the past, to challenge the old ways and to prove that the country could compete with the Western powers in fields like medicine, technology, and education. In the medical field, however, the stakes were high. There was an overwhelming desire to advance medical research, to discover new treatments for the diseases and conditions that ravaged the population. Diseases like tuberculosis, syphilis, and cholera were rampant, and there was an increasing belief that science held the key to overcoming them. But for all the optimism surrounding the potential of scientific progress, there was also an undercurrent of fear of what could happen when science was pushed too far, when the unknowns of the human mind were examined too closely. It was during this time of intense scientific ambition that the neurologist in Moscow began his research. This particular scientist was part of a small but growing group of medical professionals who were dedicated to advancing the field of neurology. They saw the human brain as a vast, unexplored frontier, with untold mysteries that, if unlocked, could change the very fabric of human understanding. The neurologist in question had spent years studying the existing literature on the brain, attending international conferences, and absorbing the latest theories and techniques from Western Europe. His mind was set on a singular goal: to discover a way to cure the ailments of the mind, to bring new hope to those suffering from neurological disorders. The scientist's work was not without its controversies. Though the broader medical community was eager to see breakthroughs in neurology, there was a growing skepticism regarding the ethical ramifications of some of the methods being used. The lines between curiosity-driven research and outright exploitation began to blur. It was clear that the scientist in question was driven by more than just a desire for knowledge. There was an unmistakable thirst for recognition, for fame, and for the acclaim that would come with achieving something no one else had. His ambition was palpable, and it would ultimately prove to be both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. In this climate of eager scientific exploration, the stage was set for an experiment that would later be viewed as a tragic turning point in the history of neurology. The groundwork had been laid, the motivation was clear, and the potential for discovery seemed limitless. But as the neurologist set out to push the boundaries of medical knowledge, he was unaware that his search for answers would ultimately lead him down a path from which there would be no return. The experiment he would undertake was one that would test not only the limits of science but also the very ethical foundations of medical research itself. What began as a well-intentioned quest for knowledge would soon reveal its darker side, a side that would remain hidden for years to come. The story of the forbidden study would unfold, not just as a tale of ambition gone wrong, but as a chilling reminder of the consequences of pushing the boundaries of scientific inquiry without considering the cost to human life. The neurologist at the center of this forbidden study was a man whose ambition and brilliance were matched only by his relentless pursuit of scientific discovery. To understand his actions and the tragic path that would unfold, one must first delve into his character, the driving force behind the study, the reason why he felt compelled to push the boundaries of medical science, even at the cost of human life. A figure who could be described as both visionary and deeply flawed, he believed that his work would change the future of neurology and revolutionize the way the world understood the brain. Born into a well-established family with academic roots, the neurologist's early life seemed destined for greatness. From a young age, he displayed an exceptional aptitude for science, especially in the fields of anatomy and physiology. His early education was rigorous, marked by long hours of study and a fascination with the complexities of the human body. Throughout his youth, he was encouraged to follow in the footsteps of his predecessors, who had made significant strides in the natural sciences. However, despite his solid academic foundation, there was a deep yearning within him to push beyond the limits of conventional thought, to explore the uncharted territories of the human mind in a way no one had done before. By the time he entered medical school in Moscow, the world of neurology was still in its nascent stages. Though there had been some breakthroughs in brain research, many aspects of the mind remained a mystery. This uncertainty only fueled his desire to explore the unknown, to break down the walls that separated human understanding from the truths locked within the brain. His professors, some of the leading figures in Russian medicine, saw in him a rare combination of intellectual brilliance and an unwavering commitment to the pursuit of knowledge. But there was something else about him that set him apart, an obsession with discovery that seemed to overshadow everything else in his life. As he progressed in his studies, the young neurologist became increasingly fascinated by the notion of neuroplasticity and the ways in which the human brain could adapt and change. The theory that the brain could be reshaped, its function altered through intervention, fascinated him. He was drawn to the possibility of manipulating the brain structure and, in doing so, curing debilitating disorders that had plagued humanity for centuries. This obsession with finding a cure for neurological diseases, especially those that caused irreparable damage to the brain and mind, became the cornerstone of his career. His fascination with the brain's plasticity grew deeper, evolving into a near obsession with understanding how far one could push the brain's limits, how much could be altered before the very essence of a person's identity was lost. In his early career, he made a name for himself with several promising studies that garnered attention both within Russia and abroad. His early work focused on the anatomical structure of the brain and its relationship to behavior, a line of inquiry that was both innovative and controversial. He quickly gained a reputation as a brilliant and ambitious scientist, someone who was willing to take risks to make discoveries that others would not dare attempt. But beneath his clinical precision and intellectual rigor, there were signs that his ambition was beginning to take a darker turn. The young neurologist was not the only one fascinated by the mysteries of the human brain. The early 1900s were a time of rapid scientific progress, and neurology was one of the most exciting fields of research. However, it was also a time when the lines between ethical responsibility and scientific ambition were often blurred. While many researchers were cautious, respecting the moral boundaries of medical practice, others, like the neurologist in question, believed that the end justified the means. This mindset, the belief that scientific progress could not be slowed by concerns about ethics, was a dangerous one, and it would have catastrophic consequences for the scientist and his subjects. As his research advanced, the neurologist became increasingly obsessed with the idea of directly intervening in the brain's function. He was no longer content with studying the brain structure from afar. He wanted to alter it, to manipulate it in ways that could potentially unlock untapped potentials within the human mind. This is where his thinking began to diverge from mainstream scientific practice. While other neurologists were exploring less invasive methods of brain research, he pushed for direct, often violent interventions, surgical procedures and experimental techniques that were untested and fraught with danger. But his unwavering belief in the potential of his work, and his unshakable conviction that it could lead to revolutionary medical advances, kept him blind to the risks. The turning point came when he decided to undertake an experiment that would push his ideas to the extreme. For the neurologist, this was the culmination of years of theory and practice, a chance to prove once and for all that the brain could be reprogrammed, reshaped, and healed. He envisioned a world where mental disorders, from schizophrenia to paralysis, could be cured with a combination of advanced surgery and experimental techniques. He began to devise a plan for an experiment that would test these ideas in real, living subjects. But as he began to seek out participants for his study, the ethical implications of his actions were ignored. The patients who were selected were often vulnerable individuals, those suffering from severe neurological disorders, or people from lower socioeconomic classes who had little access to proper medical care. The neurologist justified this decision by telling himself that these individuals were in desperate need of help, that the risk of harm was minimal compared to the potential rewards. They were, in his view, expendable, a means to an end. His focus was solely on the potential for discovery, on the chance to achieve something that could change the field of neurology forever. In his mind, the moral cost was secondary to the promise of what could be learned. The participants, many of whom were unaware of the full extent of the risks involved, were subjected to a variety of invasive procedures. These included experimental brain surgeries that would alter the functioning of their brains, chemical injections intended to stimulate certain neural pathways, and other methods that had never been tested on humans. The neurologist viewed these procedures as necessary steps toward understanding the brain's inner workings, but the reality was far darker. For each intervention, there was no guarantee of success, only the hope that something valuable would come from it. Despite the growing signs of failure, the neurologist's obsession with his work blinded him to the suffering he was causing. As the days passed, the patients began to show signs of severe distress. Some developed violent behavioral changes, while others suffered from debilitating physical effects, paralysis, tremors, and speech disorders. The neurologist, however, refused to acknowledge the severity of these outcomes. Instead of halting the study and re-evaluating his methods, he chose to press on. He convinced himself that the patient's reactions were temporary, that the brain's plasticity would eventually allow them to recover. But the damage was becoming increasingly apparent. His obsession grew as the experiment continued to unfold, with each new failure driving him further into a state of denial. The once brilliant neurologist, who had started his career with the best of intentions, was now ensnared by his own ambition. His desire to make history, to be remembered as the man who unlocked the secrets of the human brain, was overpowering everything else. And as the suffering of his subjects mounted, the question that haunted the minds of those around him became more pressing. Was the promise of scientific discovery worth the human cost? The neurologist's pursuit of knowledge, once driven by the purest scientific curiosity, had transformed into an obsession that ignored the boundaries of human decency. In his mind, the risks were justified, the suffering inevitable, and the rewards, if he succeeded, would be worth any price. But as the lines between science and cruelty began to blur, it became clear that the experiment would spiral out of control, taking him down a path from which there would be no return. The man who had once set out to heal the mind would now find himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The experiment was conceived as a means to unravel the deepest mysteries of the human mind. At its core, the neurologist's ambition was to prove that the human brain was far more adaptable than anyone had previously thought, that with the right intervention, it could be reshaped, reprogrammed, and healed in ways previously believed impossible. He believed that by manipulating the very fabric of consciousness itself, he could offer humanity a new hope for those suffering from mental illnesses and neurological disorders. The concept was not entirely novel. After all, similar ideas had been explored in Europe, but they had not yet been tested in such an invasive, direct manner. Moscow, with its mix of academic promise and a growing appetite for cutting-edge research, seemed like the perfect place to undertake such a dangerous experiment. The scientist was driven by a singular vision, a vision of progress and discovery that would not be constrained by the limitations of his time. He believed that the end justified the means, that the potential breakthroughs in understanding the brain were worth the risks. The subjects of his experiment, many of whom were already suffering from severe neurological disorders, were seen as the key to unlocking these secrets. They were patients who, in the eyes of the neurologist, had little to lose, and their participation in his study would provide the necessary data to push neurology into a new era. In his mind, these were not just patients, they were stepping stones in the pursuit of a greater truth. The groundwork for the experiment was laid out carefully, with great attention paid to the scientific theories that underpinned the methodology. The neurologist planned to explore areas of the brain that were still largely unexplored, to delve into the mechanics of consciousness itself. His focus was on the areas of the brain that govern memory, emotion, and behavior, regions that controlled the very essence of human experience. These were the parts of the brain that, he believed, held the key to understanding mental illness and disorders like epilepsy, paralysis, and schizophrenia. If these regions could be understood and manipulated, the potential for medical advancement would be immeasurable. In many ways, the study mirrored the early days of neurology, when doctors and researchers experimented with rudimentary surgical techniques and untested drugs in an effort to discover cures for previously incurable diseases. But while the field had progressed considerably in the years before the experiment began, it was still filled with uncertainties. The methods employed by the neurologist, while groundbreaking, were also dangerous and unproven. The ethical guidelines that govern modern-day research were nowhere near as developed as they would become in later years, and the potential risks of the experiment were largely ignored in favor of the promise of discovery. The first stage of the experiment involved the selection of the subjects. These were individuals suffering from a variety of neurological and psychological conditions. Many were victims of traumatic brain injuries, while others had long histories of mental illness. Some were homeless, living on the margins of society, while others were institutionalized patients who had been diagnosed with conditions such as schizophrenia or epilepsy. All of them were vulnerable in some way, either by their physical or mental health, and many were in desperate need of treatment. Some of them had been rejected by other medical practitioners, others had nowhere else to turn, and still, others were simply willing to take any chance they could for a cure. The neurologist, believing that his methods would offer these patients a better chance at life, did not hesitate to subject them to his experimental procedures. The plan was to conduct a series of invasive surgeries that would involve opening up the skull and directly manipulating parts of the brain in ways that had never been attempted before. The surgeries would be designed to stimulate certain areas of the brain, perhaps even altering their function to achieve desired therapeutic effects. In his mind, these procedures were justified by the potential rewards. If the experiment succeeded, it could change the way the world viewed the treatment of neurological diseases. The possibilities seemed endless. At first, the neurologist's approach was met with a sense of excitement from the medical community. He was, after all, an expert in his field, and his reputation as a capable and driven scientist had earned him respect. His research was seen as bold, daring, and potentially revolutionary. Even though some colleagues expressed doubts, they were quickly quieted by the scientist's forceful convictions and his assurances that the risks were minimal. The procedures were described in the language of possibility, with terms like cutting edge, groundbreaking, and potential cure being used to frame the work as a pioneering effort that could put Moscow and the Russian medical community on the map. The experiment began in earnest, with the first few surgeries conducted under the pretext of being exploratory in nature. The neurologist, in his obsession to find answers, made sure that each procedure was meticulously planned, the methodology carefully documented. He sought to create a record that would leave no stone unturned, every possible avenue for discovery explored. But as the surgeries began, it quickly became apparent that the results were not as anticipated. The patients, many of whom had been chosen for their severe conditions, began to exhibit strange and alarming symptoms shortly after the procedures. At first, these were subtle, slight tremors, momentary lapses in memory, a feeling of disorientation. But as the days went on, the symptoms worsened. Patients who had undergone the procedures began to experience more extreme effects, violent outbursts, debilitating confusion, even hallucinations. The neurologist was undeterred. He convinced himself that these reactions were temporary, that they were part of the healing process. The brain, after all, was a complex organ, and change took time. Perhaps, in the long run, these patients would emerge stronger, more capable of functioning normally. He assured himself that the gains would far outweigh the temporary discomforts. But as the weeks passed, the situation became increasingly dire. The patient's conditions did not improve. Some deteriorated rapidly, suffering from permanent cognitive impairment, loss of motor control, or violent psychological episodes. The procedures, which were supposed to heal and improve the brain, were instead causing untold harm. The neurologist began to notice patterns in the reactions. Certain areas of the brain, it seemed, were more sensitive to the interventions than others. Yet he refused to acknowledge the failure of his methods. Instead, he pushed forward, convinced that with each new procedure, with each adjustment to the technique, he would eventually unlock the secret of the brain's true potential. The more the experiment progressed, the more detached from reality the neurologist became. The idea of scientific discovery, the allure of fame, of changing the course of history, began to overshadow his compassion for the patients he was supposed to be helping. His focus was no longer on the individuals in front of him, but rather on the grand promise of his work, on the potential for a groundbreaking discovery that would cement his place in the annals of scientific history. The patients, whose bodies and minds were being torn apart, were now little more than pawns in the neurologist's obsessive quest for answers. The tragedy of the experiment lay not just in the failure of the procedures themselves, but in the fact that the neurologist had lost sight of what truly mattered. His vision of the future had become clouded by ambition, and in the process, he had disregarded the ethical boundaries that should have governed his actions. What was meant to be an act of healing had become an act of cruelty, all in the name of scientific progress. And as the patient suffered, the neurologist's belief in the righteousness of his work only deepened, blinding him to the damage he was causing. The subjects of the experiment were, in many ways, the most tragic figures of this entire story, individuals whose lives were forever altered by a series of misguided decisions made by the very person who should have been trying to heal them. These were not the typical subjects of scientific research, healthy volunteers or willing participants. They were patients already suffering from severe neurological or psychological conditions, many of whom had been rejected by the medical establishment or left to languish in asylums and hospitals, where they received minimal care or attention. Some were homeless, living on the fringes of society, while others were institutionalized for conditions that were deemed beyond treatment. They were desperate, often hopeless, and at their lowest point. And when the neurologist offered them a chance to be part of something that could change their lives, they eagerly accepted, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. For these individuals, the neurologist's study presented an opportunity, albeit one born out of naivete. Most of them had no idea what they were signing up for when they agreed to be part of the experiment. The full extent of the risks was never explained to them. Instead, they were promised something that seemed too good to be true: relief from their debilitating symptoms, a chance to regain a sense of normalcy, or, in some cases, to finally be cured of the afflictions that had defined their existence. The idea of being part of a medical breakthrough, the possibility of being at the forefront of a new era in brain science, gave them a glimmer of hope that had long been extinguished by their previous experiences with the medical system. The neurologist, meanwhile, convinced himself that his methods, however extreme, were justified by the potential benefits, and in his mind, these patients were merely a means to an end. The patient's suffering was, in his view, an unfortunate but necessary part of the process. The patients were chosen for their conditions that modern science had failed to treat effectively. Many were suffering from severe neurological disorders, such as epilepsy, paralysis, or schizophrenia, which at the time were thought to be largely untreatable. There were also those who had sustained traumatic brain injuries, people whose brains had been damaged by accidents or violence, leaving them with cognitive or physical impairments that rendered them dependent on others for even the simplest tasks. These individuals, many of whom had been abandoned by society, found themselves at the mercy of the neurologist's experimental treatments. They were offered the hope of a cure, something that was rare in the world of early 20th century medicine, especially for those suffering from neurological conditions. Their participation in the study was not just a chance at treatment, it was a chance at redemption, at a life that might be better than the one they had been forced to live. The first few days of the experiment seemed hopeful. The patients, though understandably nervous about the surgeries and the untested methods, were assured that their participation was crucial to the advancement of medical science. The neurologist was confident that the procedures would work, that the alterations he made to the brain would ultimately lead to dramatic improvements. However, as the surgeries began to unfold and the interventions began to take effect, it became clear that the results were not what anyone had hoped for. Some patients began to exhibit strange side effects: tremors, speech difficulties, severe headaches, symptoms that were previously absent from their conditions. These were brushed off as temporary side effects of the procedure, expected reactions that would eventually subside as the brain adjusted to the changes. But as the days turned into weeks, the symptoms worsened. Instead of improvement, the patients began to deteriorate. Cognitive functions, once relatively stable, began to decline rapidly. Those who had been able to walk or speak were now unable to do so without assistance. The neurologist, however, insisted that these symptoms were part of the process, that the brain was in a state of flux, and that they simply needed more time. He was unwilling to consider the possibility that his methods were causing irreparable damage. The patients, meanwhile, grew more confused and frightened. They had come to him for help, for a cure, and instead they were being subjected to a cruel experiment that seemed to have no end in sight. The neurologist's refusal to acknowledge the failure of his methods had devastating consequences for the patients. They were subjected to further procedures, each one more invasive and damaging than the last. The procedures were designed to correct the adverse effects of the previous ones, but instead, they only seemed to exacerbate the patient's conditions. The more the neurologist pressed forward, the more the patients began to suffer, their bodies and minds pushed beyond their limits. Their once vibrant personalities began to fade, replaced by confusion, aggression, or an unresponsive stupor. Some of the patients, unable to endure the pain and confusion, descended into madness, their once sharp minds consumed by the trauma inflicted upon them. One of the most tragic aspects of this experiment was the complete disregard for the patient's autonomy. These individuals were not given the opportunity to make informed decisions about their treatment. They were not told of the risks in full, nor were they made aware of the possibility that the experiment could fail catastrophically. The neurologist, consumed by his ambition, saw them not as human beings, but as tools for his own pursuit of scientific glory. They were means to an end, sacrifices that had to be made for the advancement of knowledge. His focus was not on their well-being, but on the potential for discovery, the promise of fame and recognition that would come with the successful completion of the study. As the patient's conditions worsened, some began to plead for the experiment to end. They begged for the procedures to stop, for the pain to cease, for a return to their previous lives. But the neurologist, unable to face the truth of his failure, ignored their cries. He continued to press forward, convinced that success was just around the corner, that if he could just push a little further, the results would be miraculous. His obsession with the experiment blinded him to the suffering of the very people he had promised to help. In his mind, they had already sacrificed so much for the sake of science, and their suffering was merely a small price to pay for the greater good. The physical and psychological toll on the patients was immense. Some were left permanently damaged by the procedures, unable to speak, walk, or think coherently. Others experienced severe emotional distress, with many suffering from hallucinations, violent outbursts, or an inability to recognize even their closest loved ones. Some patients, once so full of potential, were left in a permanent state of cognitive disarray, unable to function independently. Their hopes for recovery, once so high, had been dashed in a cruel twist of fate. These individuals were victims not only of the neurologist's experimental methods, but also of the systemic failures within the medical community that allowed such an unethical study to take place. What made this tragedy even more heartbreaking was that many of these patients had nowhere else to turn. They were not part of the medical elite, nor were they protected by social systems that might have intervened on their behalf. They were the forgotten, the ignored, the marginalized. In seeking treatment, they were vulnerable, not just because of their illnesses, but because they were at the mercy of a system that valued scientific progress over human life. The neurologist's grand ambitions were built on their suffering, and their pain would become the price he paid for his blind pursuit of knowledge. In the end, these patients became the forgotten casualties of a dark chapter in the history of neurology. Their stories were never fully told, their names never fully known. They were lost to history, their suffering buried beneath the weight of a failed experiment and the ambition of a man who, in the pursuit of greatness, lost sight of the very people he had intended to help. What should have been a path to recovery became a nightmare of irreversible damage, leaving only broken lives in its wake. The neurologist's inability to see these patients as anything other than tools for scientific discovery ensured that their suffering would be ignored, and that the true cost of his experiment would remain hidden for decades. As the experiment continued to spiral out of control, the damage caused by the neurologist's unyielding pursuit of knowledge became undeniable. The patients, whose lives had already been precarious, now found themselves subjected to even greater suffering, their bodies and minds slowly eroding under the weight of the cruel procedures they had been forced to endure. What had begun as a promise of hope, a glimmer of relief from their afflictions, had turned into a waking nightmare. Their physical and mental states deteriorated, and the grim reality of their situation became more apparent with each passing day. Yet, the neurologist, blinded by his ambition and a refusal to accept failure, pressed on with the experiment as if nothing had changed. He believed that his discoveries were too important to abandon, that the potential benefits of his work far outweighed the horrors that were unfolding before him. The walls of the laboratory, where the surgeries were being performed, became increasingly isolated. The neurologist surrounded himself with a small group of trusted assistants, each one complicit in the escalating horrors. Their role was to carry out the surgeries, to monitor the patients, and to ensure that the experiment proceeded according to the strict protocols he had laid out. But as the number of patients suffering from debilitating side effects grew, it became impossible for them to ignore the catastrophic results. They, too, began to question the validity of the experiment, and some of them silently hoped for it to end before more harm could be done. Yet, under the neurologist's intense pressure, they kept their doubts to themselves. His confidence, his assurance that the research would eventually lead to great success, was contagious. The promise of scientific immortality through a groundbreaking discovery was a powerful motivator. The assistants, though uneasy, were too afraid of opposing him to act on their growing concerns. Despite the increasing number of patients showing signs of irreversible damage, the neurologist kept convincing himself that he was on the verge of a breakthrough. His theory, he told himself, was still sound. The mind, after all, was a vast and uncharted frontier, and no one had ventured into its depths the way he was attempting to. What he failed to see, however, was that his desire for discovery was rapidly overtaking his sense of ethical responsibility. He had long ceased to view the patients as human beings, but rather as experiments, as tools to prove a point. His obsession with success blinded him to the humanity of those under his care. He could no longer see them as individuals with lives outside of the laboratory. They were mere stepping stones to the glory he envisioned. One of the most disturbing aspects of the experiment was the complete absence of oversight. The medical community in Russia, and especially in Moscow, was still grappling with the ethics of neurology and psychiatric care. Standards of patient consent, informed or otherwise, were still being established, and many doctors and researchers believed that the ultimate goal of medical science justified any means necessary. The idea that the ends could justify the means was deeply ingrained in the medical culture at the time, particularly among those researchers who were driven by the promise of fame, recognition, and advancement. The neurologist, in his pursuit of groundbreaking discovery, had convinced himself that the potential for curing mental illness, for curing conditions that were considered beyond hope, outweighed any concerns about the ethics of his methods. As the suffering of his patients mounted, however, the boundaries between ethical responsibility and scientific ambition blurred completely. The patients, who had once been hopeful, began to lose their grip on reality. The experimental procedures, which were meant to bring about a cure, instead pushed them deeper into suffering. Some exhibited severe physical symptoms: muscle spasms, loss of motor control, uncontrollable shaking. Others experienced mental disintegration, their minds fragmented by the intrusive surgeries and the shock to their neural systems. Some became increasingly violent, lashing out in confusion and fear, unable to make sense of the changes happening to them. The neurologist, meanwhile, wrote off these reactions as part of the healing process, convinced that they would eventually subside as the brain adapted to the changes. He could not, or would not, accept that his methods were the cause of the patient's suffering. His belief in the promise of his research had created a psychological block that kept him from seeing the reality of what was happening before him. But the reality was impossible to ignore. As the experiment continued, more and more patients were affected by the disastrous outcomes. Some were rendered completely immobile, their limbs paralyzed or rendered useless by the surgical alterations. Others were left in a state of complete mental collapse, unable to recognize even their closest relatives or speak coherently. The neurologist's belief in his theories remained unshaken, even as the patient's conditions worsened. He dismissed their suffering, seeing it not as a failure of his methods, but as an unfortunate but necessary part of the process. Each day that passed without the expected improvement became a source of frustration for him, but he refused to acknowledge the possibility that his research had gone horribly awry. Behind closed doors, whispers began to spread among the medical community. Some of the neurologist's colleagues, who had once supported his research, began to voice their concerns. They had heard rumors of the patient's deteriorating conditions, of the side effects that were becoming increasingly severe and irreversible. Some of them reached out to the neurologist in private, urging him to stop the experiment before more lives were ruined. But the neurologist, consumed by his obsession, shut them out. He could not afford to let doubt creep into his mind, not when he was so close to achieving what no one else had. His refusal to listen to reason, to the very medical colleagues who might have saved him from his own folly, sealed the fate of the patients. The assistants, too, began to grow uneasy. Many of them had entered the experiment with a genuine desire to help, to contribute to the advancement of medical science. But as they witnessed the slow and painful breakdown of the patients, they began to question the moral foundation of the work they were doing. Some started to avoid the surgeries altogether, feigning illness or reluctance. They could not bear to watch the agony unfold, nor could they stand to be complicit in the suffering. But even those who remained involved began to see the toll the experiment was taking on their own psyches. They were becoming desensitized to the pain of the patients, numbed by the constant exposure to suffering, and by their own role in perpetuating it. The patients, once individuals with hopes for recovery, were now mere casualties in a scientific experiment gone terribly wrong. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the experiment that had started with such promise descended further into tragedy. The patients, many of whom had been promised relief, found themselves trapped in a cycle of ever-deepening despair. The neurologist, meanwhile, continued his work, driven by an obsession that had overtaken every other part of his existence. He could no longer see the faces of the patients as people. In his mind, they had become little more than data points, casualties on the road to a grand discovery. What had begun as an exploration of the human mind a search for understanding and healing, had instead become a horrific testament to the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. The once hopeful faces of the patients, those who had trusted the neurologist to help them, were now lost in a haze of suffering. Their lives had been altered in ways that could never be undone. Their bodies had been ravaged by invasive surgery, their minds fractured by the brutal interventions of a man who had lost his way. The tragedy of the experiment lay not just in the irreversible damage inflicted upon these patients, but in the fact that it was all preventable. Had the neurologist heeded the warnings, had he paused to consider the ethical implications of his work, the suffering could have been avoided. But his obsession with success, with the promise of scientific greatness, had overshadowed every other consideration. The patients, once hopeful for a cure, were now nothing more than victims, forgotten casualties of a dark chapter in the history of medical science. They would never be remembered as heroes of progress, their names lost to time. Instead, their suffering would remain as a grim reminder of the dangers of scientific overreach and the cost of ambition unchecked by ethical consideration. As the experiment spiraled further into chaos, the consequences of the neurologist's unchecked ambition began to attract attention, albeit too late to save those who had already been harmed. While the patients continued to suffer under the brutal and invasive procedures, whispers began to circulate beyond the confines of the laboratory. Initially, these whispers were confined to those who worked closely with the neurologist, his assistants and colleagues who had seen the slow unraveling of the project. But as word began to spread, the experiment's more grisly details started to reach the broader medical community in Moscow, and soon, to the public. What had been intended as a pioneering breakthrough in neurology was rapidly becoming a scandal. At first, the neurologist's reputation as a brilliant scientist and rising star shielded him from immediate scrutiny. His past accomplishments, his early work that had garnered respect within medical circles, allowed him to continue the experiment despite the mounting signs of failure. There was also the pervasive attitude of the time, the belief that the pursuit of scientific progress, no matter the cost, was the highest calling. The medical establishment in Russia, though deeply flawed, still held to the idea that the ultimate goal of curing human suffering justified nearly any means. The neurologist, in this sense, was seen by many as a visionary, someone who was willing to push the boundaries of known science for the greater good. This aura of brilliance protected him for a time, even as the true scale of his actions began to surface. But the more patients who were subjected to the experiments, the more their suffering became too evident to ignore. The physical and psychological toll began to show in ways that were undeniable. The more severe the reactions, the more impossible it became to hide the truth. News of these deteriorating conditions started to filter out to other doctors, some of whom had been friends and colleagues of the neurologist. At first, there were private conversations, polite inquiries, and hushed meetings behind closed doors. But as the number of patients suffering from irreversible damage increased, the whispers grew louder. Eventually, concerns were raised to the higher echelons of the medical community, and a few brave individuals began to question the ethics of the research. It was a difficult thing for many to come to terms with. The neurologist had been well respected, admired even, for his intellect and his early contributions to neurology. To speak out against him, to accuse him of malpractice, was seen by some as an attack on the future of science itself. After all, many believed that his research held the key to unlocking some of the deepest mysteries of the human mind. There was an undeniable allure to his vision. The potential to cure mental disorders, to alleviate the suffering of millions of people, was a compelling dream. But as the evidence mounted, even the most stalwart defenders of his work began to falter. By now, the situation had become untenable. As the patient's conditions worsened, the neurologist became more isolated, not only from the medical community but from reality itself. His once assured belief that the end justified the means began to crack, though only in private moments. Publicly, he remained steadfast. He told himself, perhaps to retain his own sense of purpose, that the suffering of the patients would eventually be vindicated, that this was simply the price of progress, the necessary trials on the road to discovery. But the faces of the patients, twisted in pain, haunted him in the quiet hours. The thought that his pursuit of fame, his obsession with being remembered as a great innovator, might have led him down a dark, irreversible path, was a reality he could not face. Instead, he buried himself in his work, pushing away any thoughts of failure, disregarding the pleas of those who now begged for the experiment to stop. Meanwhile, the patients, once hopeful that the experiment would offer them a new chance at life, found themselves trapped in a medical nightmare. Their conditions had only worsened, not improved. Those who had not already been rendered permanently disabled or mentally fractured began to lose their grasp on any hope they once had. Some became so disoriented that they could no longer recognize themselves in a mirror, their faces alien to them as their minds splintered further. Others, whose memories had once been intact, began to lose even the most basic recollections, unable to remember the faces of loved ones or the events that had defined their lives. It was as if they had become ghosts, trapped in bodies that were no longer their own. The neurologist, oblivious to the full extent of the damage he had caused, was content to write off these tragic outcomes as mere side effects, unavoidable consequences of such groundbreaking work. However, the repercussions of the experiment were impossible to ignore forever. The patients began to attract more attention, and eventually, some of their families, desperate to find out what had happened to their loved ones, started making inquiries. They began to suspect that something was terribly wrong, that the treatments their family members had undergone were not just ineffective but actively harming them. With mounting concern, relatives of the patients started to gather information, connecting the dots and piecing together a picture of an experiment gone horribly awry. It wasn't long before the authorities took notice. Complaints about the treatments, and stories of the patients' deteriorating health, eventually reached the medical ethics boards. An investigation was launched, and the full extent of the damage caused by the neurologist's experiment began to emerge. What was once a tightly controlled and isolated project began to unravel as medical professionals who had once turned a blind eye were forced to confront the ugly truth. The findings were as grim as they were damning. Patients had been subjected to unnecessary and inhumane procedures, their consent obtained under dubious circumstances, their suffering ignored in favor of scientific progress. The entire experiment had been conducted without the proper ethical oversight, a glaring violation of medical standards. In the face of the mounting evidence, the neurologist could no longer maintain his facade. The carefully constructed narrative he had built around his work began to crumble. The promises of revolutionizing the field of neurology now seemed hollow, a distant fantasy that had been paid for with the lives and minds of vulnerable individuals. The neurologist, once seen as a visionary, was now regarded with horror and contempt. The medical community that had once lauded him for his brilliance now recoiled in disgust at what his ambition had wrought. But even as the investigation exposed the full scale of the damage, the neurologist remained defiant. He was unwilling to accept responsibility for what had happened, continuing to argue that the potential benefits of his work had been worth the costs. In his mind, he had not failed. He had merely been ahead of his time, a pioneer whose genius was not yet fully appreciated. But as more patients came forward with their families to recount their suffering, it became clear that the experiment had not only failed, it had created a legacy of pain, one that would haunt the neurologist and his career for the rest of his life. Eventually, the neurologist was stripped of his professional standing. He was disbarred, his research deemed unethical and his methods branded as cruel and inhumane. The patients who had been part of his experiment were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, their bodies and minds irreparably altered by the man who had promised them salvation. Some were left with no memory of who they once were, others were left physically incapacitated, and still, others had their minds fractured beyond repair. The neurologist's once promising career was reduced to a cautionary tale, a dark chapter in the annals of medical history. In the aftermath of the scandal, a series of reforms were implemented within the Russian medical system to ensure that such a tragedy could never occur again. Ethical guidelines for experimentation were put into place, and oversight of medical research became more stringent. The public outcry over the experiment led to a greater awareness of the need for patient rights and informed consent, and a movement toward ensuring that no one, no matter how brilliant or ambitious, could escape accountability for their actions. The story of the neurologist's forbidden brain study remains a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. It is a story of hubris, of a brilliant mind consumed by the desire for fame and glory, willing to sacrifice the well-being of others in the name of progress. And while the patients who suffered in the name of this ill-fated experiment are largely forgotten, their legacy remains, a tragic testament to the cost of pushing the boundaries of knowledge without regard for the lives and dignity of those who suffer in the process. As the dust began to settle and the fallout from the scandal unfolded, a stark realization emerged within the medical community. The price of unbridled scientific ambition was far higher than anyone had imagined. The experiments that had been conducted under the guise of advancing human knowledge had instead opened a deep chasm between idealism and the harsh reality of human suffering. The neurologist, once hailed as a genius, now faced the bitter truth of his work, an irreversible legacy of pain, broken lives, and irreversible consequences. In the weeks that followed the public revelations, The patients who had been subjected to the grueling experiments found themselves thrust into the spotlight, not as symbols of medical progress, but as tragic casualties of a failed vision. Some of them were unable to comprehend the extent of their own suffering. The traumatic effects on their bodies and minds were so profound that they could no longer recall who they were before the experiment. Their past lives, their identities, were erased, replaced by a fog of confusion and mental degradation. Families who had once been hopeful that the experiment might cure their loved ones now found themselves grappling with a nightmare of unforeseen consequences. Some of the patients were left with permanent disabilities, their cognitive functions severely impaired. Memory loss, emotional instability, and even complete loss of motor control became the hallmarks of their post-experiment lives. The physical damage to their brains and bodies was a constant reminder of the experiment's failure. For some, the tragedy was not just in the pain they endured, but in the crushing sense of loss of the future they had hoped for, loss of their sense of self, and loss of any chance for normalcy. Some were never able to speak again, unable to express their pain, their anger, or their confusion. They had been reduced to shadows of their former selves, trapped in bodies that no longer worked as they once had. The public reaction to the experiment was swift and unforgiving. What had once been a hopeful pursuit of understanding now became the subject of widespread horror and condemnation. In the wake of the scandal, medical professionals and ethicists began to question the very foundations of medical research and the ethical boundaries that should guide scientific exploration. The once untouchable notion that the pursuit of knowledge could justify any means was now firmly challenged. This tragedy became the cornerstone for a larger conversation about the rights of patients, the need for informed consent, and the ethical responsibility of those who conduct experiments. The legal consequences for the neurologist were swift and brutal. A public trial was set in motion, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Documents, testimonies, and the undeniable suffering of the patients made his case one of the most disturbing in the history of medical malpractice.